Hi, good afternoon, everybody. We are here today in Germany, and we have the very big pleasure today to talk about the future of IT. This is a series that we've put together at Lufthansa Systems to get deeply into this exciting new industry of urban air mobility. Today, the third event, we are bringing the focus now to ground ops and infrastructure. And we have a very full packed 2 hours ahead of us today. We have 5 great speakers to give a 360-degree view of this industry and all of the new developments that are needed from a ground maintenance, infrastructure, real estate perspective. And we are going to introduce the speakers in a moment and then break into a panel discussion and go through several different blocks of topics. Today, we have a couple of housekeeping topics to get to very quickly, and that is number one, that the event will be recorded. So you will be able to see it later on LinkedIn. Usually we post the event a few days later. We have the weekend in between and it should be up next week for you. So that's the first topic. And the second thing is that all of the speakers' microphones will be turned off when they're not speaking. And we can use a chat function. If all of the audience would look at the Q&A function, this is where you guys can write in your questions to the speakers, and I will be fielding these questions and giving them. So feel free anytime to start asking questions and I will field them. We decided to kick off this event series at Lufthansa Systems because this is such an exciting industry. We are in classic aviation. We are an IT company and the digital arm of the Lufthansa Group. We have a very big focus within our product areas on flight operations and ground operations, as well as network planning and the revenue management, commercial aspects of flight in classic aviation, as well as predictive maintenance and in-flight entertainment, all of the different types of apps that are used by the crew and the cockpit on board, and then have a consulting section. This is where I belong, and also have a zero-G and AI and analytics company, all basically furthering technology to the aviation industry. And we thought, what a great breadth of knowledge to and technology to now share with the UAM industry. This is why we've kicked this off, and thank you for tuning in to further the discussion with us. So without further ado, today we have speaker presentations and then we will get into the panel. I would like to introduce now our speakers. From Volocopter, we have Jörn Jaeger, who is head of aerospace and ground infrastructure. We had a colleague, Florian Adolf, a few months ago who did a great job, and I'm very excited to see Volocopter is such a fantastic company, very excited to see what Jörn has to say. Then we have all the way calling from Orlando very early. We have Matt Broffman from City of Orlando. He is head of innovation and heading up this very, very unique project with Lilium to connect the City of Orlando with the City of Tampa in a fantastic, groundbreaking, completely new business venture there, giving us the perspective of, regulatory cities, what are their challenges. Then we have Damien Keisley from Skyports, the leading ground infrastructure operator for UAM at the moment, and coming from the startup perspective. So this is a very interesting perspective that we need here in order to flesh out what is really going to be required to have a tangible offer for the UAM providers and also for the passengers that need to use this infrastructure at the end of the day. Next, we have a colleague of mine, Klaas, and Klaas joins us from Lufthansa Technik today. Klaas is actually the consolidator of all of the UAM activities for the whole Lufthansa group. So very good guy to know. I'm very pleased to know him, and we're going to hear about some specific challenges that he's had in projects that the Lufthansa group has already looked into of doing within Germany, and started with different tests. And then finally, we have my colleague Andreas Radig, who is the product owner of Netline, and he can give a lot of insights into how to use IT systems and data, and to start figuring out how to optimize all of this, how to make money with UAM from a technology perspective. So I think that this is also incredibly interesting, and I would like to now give the floor to Jörn from Volocopter. Jörn, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having us again as Volocopter. So I'm pleased to give you a short introductory presentation on Volocopter, what we see as the main challenges as far as the infrastructure is concerned, and also what we do as Volocopter here. I guess most of you, if not all, are well aware who Volocopter is, what we do. Just to remind you that we have achieved consistently some world's first when it comes to actually executing flights. Already back in 2016, we started our first flights, and we have a couple of ongoing public demonstrations. So this is not something we only see in renderings and artificial videos, but actually we practice that, and we have hundreds of hours of flight tests already. So we are really talking here about something that will come very soon. This also applies, of course, to infrastructure, where we as Volocopter not only invest and design our aircraft, but also have a clear view on the infrastructure, how it should look like, and what about the ground operations, as we are well aware that we have to keep in mind the whole value chain. It's not only about the aircraft. So in this respect, we were very proud to demonstrate and to show the first Voloport together with Skyports in 2019 in Singapore. Also, just a brief reminder, what are we targeting with our product? So our first aircraft will be the so-called VoloCity. It is strictly designed and will operate in urban environments within a range of roughly 20 nautical miles, because we consider this a quite interesting market and what is actually feasible also with the given technology at hand, so that we really want to stay ahead of the crowd and implement the service within the next 2 to maximum 3 years. Looking a bit closer to the infrastructure, we as Volocopter, as I said before, have clear view that we need to be aware of the whole value chain and the whole customer journey. And here also the Voloport, as we call it, which is our branding for the Vertiport. I think Vertiport is quite familiar to you as well, plays an important role. Of course, we always have to think from the customer perspective. So we put the customer in the center, and then we see how it has to be designed in terms of the customer journey, and of course also for the aircraft turnaround processes on the ground. When we talk about the Vertiport, I think we have something different in mind compared to today's heliports or aerodromes. So we really see it as a new mode of transport, air mobility as its best. So this is what we understand with seamless experience. So we are working on various solutions that will look much different compared to today's world in aerodromes. So still, there are some challenges and hurdles. I guess everybody has a bit different view, but we would see one is really to come rapidly to standards as far as Vertiport is design and operations are concerned. So it has to be right now, stepwise. We are very clear, not everything can be done at once. We have to do it step by step. It has to be performance-based and also harmonized, as we see activities all around the world, but of course nobody really is happy if we see diverging developments. Second is, sorry, that of course once we put one or more Vertiports into a city, sorry, we have to talk about acceptance and the right placement, and also to see what are the timelines, which obviously, as we see, the development sometimes diverge a bit. And then, of course, it also comes once we scale up a bit more to the airspace integration issues and capacity limitations we may see. And last but not least, we definitely see the chance here to have the conventional roles as we see in current aviation a bit blurred, or also to streamline something. I mean, if we talk about collaborative decision making or SWIM concepts, I think some of you will know what it means, that we really have the chance to draw something here from the beginning and make it a very smooth and a system that actually goes hand in hand with all the stakeholders and build up something that is really capable to scale up and future proof. So what we actually do as the Volocopter, again, we have the whole value chain in mind. It all starts with the concept of operations of the VTOL aircraft. I think that is a big asset we have, as we clearly know our aircraft very well and know how we want to operate it. That means that also the ground handling processes can be clearly defined, and we are also leading the work in some standard organizations such as EuroKE, because from our perspective it's really key to have that concept clear, and only then it makes sense to start talking about infrastructure design and ground operations. That ties nicely into the next point, that we see the need and actually contribute to vertiport standards development. So we actively do our work with the EASA and EuroKE and other organizations all around the world to actually come to a standard that we can rely on, and everybody who is interested to erect that infrastructure can take as a basis. And last but not least, we actively also working on what we call the Voloport, so our version of the vertiport on the ground operation processes, and also not to forget the ground support equipment, which becomes really specific to some extent to the aircraft operations, thinking about batteries, about ground movement and things like that at higher automation levels. I think we can maybe also discuss it a bit later, what would be the implication of that. So we are all on these fronts working, and I think we are well positioned to play a major role also in future. And with that, I already conclude my presentation here. And of course, I would like to see the whole ecosystem, as we often call it, to work jointly on that solution and really also think in a solution mode. We can actually see a lot of authorities very progressively working on solutions, which makes us very happy. And yes, we are still growing, so happy always to see more competence coming on board in Volocopter or around us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jörn. And I saw some job ads for Volocopter recently on LinkedIn from you or your colleagues yesterday or the day before. So for any of you aviation people on the line, or robotics people, Volocopter might be hiring. Okay, on to you, Matt. We have Matt Broffman from City of Orlando. I'd like to hand over to you now.
Excellent. Thank you, Erin, and thanks for allowing us to come and present. I'm going to share.
Our pleasure.
Yeah, and you know, as Erin mentioned, I'm Matt Broffman, Director of Innovation for the City of Orlando, leading our advanced air mobility efforts for the past few years now. And I'll start by kind of giving you a sense of what it's how a city is, at least City of Orlando, is approaching advanced air mobility and why. And I think you kind of have to start with this idea that cities have not a great reputation for how we've handled major transportation changes in the past, right? Everything from the highway system to the automobile in general, to even dealing with Uber and Lyft more recently. And I think a lot of that is due to this fear of the unknown, and there's a reason for that. Right, we have lots of media attention and publicity, and people get ousted from office due to, and even terms created, right? This idea of a bridge to nowhere or a boondoggle. And so I think it is this fear of the unknown that it makes it difficult for government, especially at the local level, to play a role and to participate. We're taking a little bit different of an approach, and so when we look at what we do know, right, we have a policy in place today in the city, as most cities do, that allow for heliports. Ours is a fairly liberal policy in the sense that you can come in, and as long as it's for the most part safe and approved by the state and federal government, and in an area that would allow it, we would let you put one in. And so what we realize is, if we are not engaging in the advanced air mobility space, in the next 5-10 years, we will have the private sector and possibly state and federal government dictating to us what we can and can't do. And so we thought it was important, and our mayor has been, extremely supportive of this to make sure that we have a say and we find the right partners to work with to figure out how we can make sure that the advanced air mobility space impacts positively for our residents and our visitors. A little bit of the value that we think we bring, right? In Orlando, we have 75 million visitors. Right now, that's a little bit different this past year, but on a normal basis, that's what we're looking at, which, when you think about that, that's the population of Atlanta in our city, in addition to our residents every day. And so, that, is unique, in that transportation demand for those 75 million visitors is fairly predictable. It also provides users who are going to go back into other cities across the globe and have experienced potentially advanced air mobility. We obviously have knowledge of our transportation demand in our community. We view ourselves as an innovative local government with a long history of public-private partnerships to make things happen. We own public infrastructure and land, and we're experts on how to engage our community, which is not what we're talking about today, but we think is obviously a huge piece to making sure that advanced air mobility is successful. So what we're doing, right, forming partnerships, as Erin mentioned, we do have a partnership with William and Tavistock to bring to life a vertiport out by Lake Nona, which is essentially just outside of our airport and within the city limits of Orlando. But we're also forming partnerships, with other cities, with our state and federal partners, and really understanding how we can play a role again in this ecosystem so that benefits our residents. We're also iterating. I mean, as I'm sure, even for the private sector companies, it happens all the time. But even in government, we're trying to be as flexible as possible and understanding that there are lots of unknowns. And so we're going to keep learning, and our plan, that we put together will continue to change. We are in the process of thinking about what is the regional plan for advanced air mobility. Regional meaning it would include our counties and other nearby cities, because we think it's important to have everybody kind of not working from a consistent place. We're looking at what that regional plan looks like and starting to execute on building that long-term plan. Again, knowing that it will iterate and then learning. I think that's the biggest thing for a city is that we form these relationships. We're part of CAMI, which is a community air mobility initiative, which allows us to learn from both experts in the industry, but also other cities as we're going through this process. And so when I look at what are our biggest challenges, the first is infrastructure funding. I think that to the extent that we anticipate the private sector obviously playing a huge role there, I think that for it to optimize and benefit cities and local communities in the best way, it's going to be to make sure that there is public funds available to ensure that the infrastructure goes where it should go, and can do the things that it needs to do. And the second piece of that, right, is ensuring equity. We want to make sure that when we do deploy infrastructure, that we're not marginalizing any of our communities, that we're not impacting people in negative ways, that this is actually benefiting everyone, even those that aren't necessarily using it, that they are able to see that benefit. And our third challenge that we have at the city is really, where does all of this live? Our mayor, like I said, has been great and very supportive of the city doing this, but the city, geographically does not cover the entire region. And if you think about our theme parks, which everyone's familiar with, Disney, for example, is outside the city of Orlando, whereas Universal is in our convention centers, technically outside of our city limits. And so thinking about how do we create that cohesive regional plan, it's whether that's our Metropolitan Planning Association or some other group that would really help to be that presence for our community. I think everybody is trying to figure those things out. So that's a little bit about where we're at and how we're thinking about this. And I will turn it back over to Erin.
Thank you, Matt. Fantastic. Next up, we have Damian from Skyports. So I'd like to turn over to you now, Damien Keisley.
Thank you very much, Erin, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. So to kick off, my name is Damien Keisley. I'm the head of EMEA at Skyports. So my role is looking after the infrastructure business of Skyports across Europe and Middle East. Skyports is quite a young company. We've been around for about 4 years, and so our sort of sole mission in this industry is to be the leading developer and operator of ground infrastructure for the emerging electric aviation. So both looking at both the passenger side of things and cargo side of things. They might be slightly separate worlds at the moment, but we see them very much converging over the next decade. And so we want to make sure that the infrastructure that is developed around cities can accommodate both passenger and cargo transport. We are headquartered in London, now have offices around the world. One is in the west coast of the US, one is in Singapore. Although being sort of a young company, we are backed by a decade, in fact, centuries of experience with the likes of Deutsche Bahn, which is the German railway infrastructure and rail operator, Group ADP, which is the French owner, airport owner and operator, a number of others. So they bring the huge advantage of having large balance sheets and already established businesses in a number of markets where advanced air mobility is hopefully going to thrive. So what we do, Skyports essentially owns the entire value chain for infrastructure development and operations. We start with the site acquisition, so we spend a lot of time looking for the right sites where vertiports might be developed and operated, spending a lot of time with third-party property owners, whether it's private or public. We then design and build the infrastructure. We do most of the technical design and engineering in-house. We work with third-party partners on the architecture, but we bring our own capital to develop the vertiports, which is often a sort of a challenging point for a lot of not just cities, but also I guess for the industry itself. Where is the infrastructure funding going to come from? And then lastly, we're looking to operate the infrastructure. So we're not just a design agency or developer, we're looking to operate the infrastructure itself. So very similar model to what you see in today's aviation. Our customers will be the operators of the aircraft. Most of the OEMs could be the operators themselves, and that's why we see huge importance in working hand in hand with some of the leading aircraft developers, such as Volocopter. As Jörn mentioned, we built the world's first vertiport prototype in Singapore in 2019. And then we see this collaboration, especially in an industry which is not established, extremely important. As I said, we've got 3 offices around the world, trying to cover all of the emerging advanced air mobility markets that are coming live as we speak. We've got a dedicated vertiport planning and design team, which have experience planning vertiports across probably more than 15 markets at the moment, and that's growing every day. We have ongoing projects in partnership with majority of the leading OEMs, whether that's on aligning route to market and making sure that we build the infrastructure in the right place at the right time, or on the more regulatory or standard setting side, or even research, which is funded through various European or government schemes. And lastly, we spend a lot of time on regulations and standardization. I'm sure that's a topic we'll touch on today, on both sides of the pond in the US and EASA. We see that an incredibly important activity to get this industry going. I'm going to speed up. So the 3 challenges we see in infrastructure as the main ones is locating the vertiports is incredibly difficult to find the right sites, especially in urban environments. Secondly, the technology and infrastructure development cycles are not in sync. It's not as evident today, but as the technology comes to more mature levels and starts scaling at much faster levels than infrastructure can, we'll start seeing the disconnect of how quickly we can build the infrastructure to support the levels of scale that the technology demands. And that sort of brings me on the last point where today we need to be designing and planning for 15-20 years down the line. That's simply how long the infrastructure can take to build, and so we need to make sure that we anticipate what the growth of the technology will mean for the infrastructure space. And last slide, and I'll leave you with a thought. I was asked to have a wish. And what would it be? I think if I had a wish, I would wish to have more than one wish. There's a lot of unknowns that we need to solve as an industry. And so as an infrastructure company, we don't do just infrastructure. We look at the whole ecosystem and activities that need to happen prior to putting infrastructure on the ground and operating it. So whether it's everything from stakeholder engagement, demand and network modeling, all the way to airspace design, which is an inseparable part of the infrastructure space. So over time, I'll hand over my word to Erin.
Thank you, Damien, so much. We have actually a little bit more time today because we have 5 speakers. Yes, last time we had 8 and it was quite tight, but today we can relax a little bit. But that was fantastic. I would like to now turn over to Klasen from Lufthansa Technik to say a few words about the maintenance perspective, especially.
Thank you very much, Erin, and also thank you very much for the opportunity to join the discussion today, as well as for the kind introductory words. In particular, what I want to do now is give a bit of perspective, not only about the vertiports, but when we're discussing infrastructure, to adopt a systems perspective there, and starting off with what we perceive as the Aam value chain, where starting from the top, we have the commercial operations with the customer in the center and as a starting point, and below that interlinked an operations perspective, which really is around ground, flight and tech ops, and then at the bottom the hardware, which in this nascent industry is more interlinked, as we see many startups like Volocopter, for example, that not only occupy the hardware space, but also the operations and commercial space. Anyway, when we're discussing infrastructure, I think it's important to discuss the physical and the non-physical infrastructure, as well as the ground and airspace they want to occupy, considering real estate prices in cities and anyway congested airspace. And here we have the infrastructure enabling really the ground ops, the flight ops, and the tech ops, just to give a perspective how that all integrates. Here really beyond vertiports, I want to give a perspective of what we perceive what is the infrastructure we need to look at. And I think it's important, as I said earlier, to really adopt a systems perspective regarding advanced air mobility. So of course, yes, we have the vertiports and the traffic between them. Then I'm very glad that Matt is joining us to bring in a community or city perspective in that. The intention, I understand, is really to connect advanced air mobility with other modes of public transportation, and obviously from our perspective, eventually also with conventional aviation. So when we're discussing the physical infrastructure, we need to also consider the interconnections with other transport modes. And then given that city space, especially urban space, is rather expensive, not all UAVs or not all vehicles and aircraft can be parked likely at the vertiport. So we need to consider where to park them overnight if there is a flight curfew. We also need to consider how to conduct and where to conduct MRO, which will likely not be at the vertiports, at least not all cases, turnaround checks, AOG possibly, but not everything. So where to conduct MRO activities. And then obviously, as we see an electrification of a lot of transport modes, not only advanced air mobility, but also ground-based vehicles, how can the grid cope with that? One thing I want to highlight regarding sustainability, which counts for the entirety of aviation, we need hub infrastructure, we need boarding and deboarding infrastructure, we also need control infrastructure, yet we don't need route infrastructure, giving this flexible mode of transportation also an advantage when we're discussing sustainability. And then let me briefly touch up on also the enabling infrastructure we should consider, which is unmanned traffic management as a key enabler of scaled AAM operations. And we need to have a traffic management, obviously, that safely integrates with existing conventional aviation. And then we need the other ground flight tech ops enabling systems. So, for example, predictive maintenance was mentioned earlier. but that will be also a key enabler for a largely automated traffic management. Well, I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, and with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Klaas. A lot to unpack in your brief presentation, and we're looking forward to doing it in a moment. But before that, we have our last speaker, my colleague Andreas Radig, and I would like to hand over to you, Andreas.
What does it take to shape the aviation industry of tomorrow? The imagination to go beyond the existing, and the ability to bring your ideas to life. Lufthansa Systems offers airline customers an environment where they can take things from strategy to experience. We call this environment the Aviation Campus, a network of different locations, services, products, and skills. It combines IT know-how, consulting experience, technology partnership, and visionary spirits. Together we create new solutions to make aviation safer, digital, and more connected.
Yeah, quite some impressive numbers. Out of these core areas, ground operations is the part where I work in, and yeah, I'm very much looking forward to talk about the future, in fact. And we were asked to answer a question about the three main challenges and hurdles to overcome regarding urban air mobility. The first one I see from a personal perspective is the passenger acceptance, because everything depends on this, as it is the basis for commercial success as well. Only if we can convince passengers or attract passengers to use urban air mobility, yeah, we will have success. And this depends, and that leads me to the second point. We need a system approach, a system integration approach, because the air travel part is only a small part of the entire travel journey of a passenger. So it starts right at the doorstep of your house and ends at your final destination. And the success will very much depend on how all these different modes of transport and the small pieces fit together to have the travel time as short as possible, if that's the goal. And also to have it in a financially affordable way. And maybe it's also for the fun of flying, but I wouldn't rely on that. And last but not least, the third challenge that I see is the aspect of society, the acceptance in society. Already today, it is not allowed to fly with these small drones over crowded areas. So what will be the reaction of the society if these drones get bigger and bigger and there are even people on board? I think this will also play an important role to have that transparency and the acceptance in society. And the question now is, how can we contribute to make that childhood dream come true? And what is Alice-wise approach? As a established vendor of software for traditional airline business, we see many similarities between what used to be there and what is the need for this new, more flexible. And the most important one is a modular system approach, because nothing is the same at any location, at any operator, and there's so many differences that we need to make use of best of breed to address the challenges that we need. And the three core areas that we are following there is the integration, so system integration. The systems need to talk to each other. Automation, relieve the capacity of the human beings for more creative solutions and not so much on repetitive tasks. And last but not least, collaboration across the different stakeholders. And that involves the vertiports or skyports or whatever you want to call them, the air operators, but also the public transport and maybe commuters like Uber or taxi companies. So this system must be seen as one, and that's more or less a platform approach where all the stakeholders may play a role. And finally, if I had a wish, yeah, from a business perspective, I would very much like to contribute to bring traditional airline business and air mobility together to take the best of the two worlds and build a bridge between. And if I had a wish, personally, I would love to have that next station on top of the roof, and I can directly, without any need to change mode of transport, from here to wherever I want to go. I know this is a dream, but I was asked for one. So see you in the discussion, and thank you for your attention. See you.
Great, thank you so much for all of your brief introductions. Give us all a scene setting, which we will use now to jump into the panel discussion. We had some great questions already come in from the audience, and I would like to actually give the first question. Unfortunately, it says anonymous. I think there's no name behind it because of Microsoft Teams, but the question is, and I would now send it to Matt, which are the main criteria related to vertiport placement in the city? You touched on this in your introduction, but this is the most important thing, obviously. The city has to be connected, it has to be relevant infrastructure, and then also the owners of the infrastructure and the operators have to be able to make money with it. So how do you actually tackle this in real life?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all can kind of walk through and understand all the different pieces there. And like you talked about that you want to think about, right, which is how does it connect to existing transportation networks and infrastructure? I mean, let's make sure we don't forget, right, is there actually demand there? And it's pointless. And then there's the planning aspect of, how is it going to impact the surrounding community, et cetera. And then obviously airspace considerations as well. And there's, other pieces there. And so there are lots of ideal locations, and even in the city of Orlando that we've identified and we've worked with our partners to identify that we think long-term make great sense. Part of why we worked with Tavistock Development and Lilium to pick the location that we did was it kind of had a best of all worlds in the sense that it was, it's within spitting distance, if you will, of our new south terminal for the airport. And so it will be very easy from a last mile standpoint to get people to the airport. It would be far enough away from the airport, we believe, that it does not interfere with, the FAA will allow us to not interfere with any of the operations at the airport, because that is a priority for the city and for the airport. But it also, and there's the connectivity component of it as well. And then there's also nothing out there. So right now, in the vertiport location, there's no surrounding neighbors. So when we think about it from the city perspective, we always talk about who are the neighbors that are getting notified and that we need to work with and engage. And obviously, with something like a vertiport, that circle gets drawn, and for the first one, it's going to get drawn much bigger. But in terms of who it's going to impact, there's really no one out there. And so it's kind of nice that they've put this marker down and then they're building development around it. And it's a development partner that has rapidly built out and has plans to build out that area. And so that makes it kind of, for us, a really good mix of all of those worlds. I think long-term, right, the urban locations are going to be great. For us, we have a tourism corridor. Getting something out in the tourism corridor is going to be really important. And those are the type of things that we're looking at. But the problem is when you go to a community and say, we want to put a vertiport there, it's going to be way easier once they already have one in the community that they can have seen, experience, and know what that is like. And so we're hopeful that this first one will be that for us.
So this vertiport is connecting now Orlando to Tampa, right?
There have not been any other announcements officially made, I guess, about where vertiports will be part of the Florida network. There's a map that Lilium and the partners put out that includes most of the major cities in Florida. And so just yesterday, I believe the city of Palm Beach was having a meeting in which the Lilium was presenting on the project and pitching there. So it is a city-to-city connectivity primarily for the Orlando vertiport that Lilium's use case is. But we obviously anticipate having multiple providers in hopefully any city anticipates right now, having multiple providers providing different, really services depending on the offering that they have.
Okay, so then if we're understanding correctly from what you just said, then Lilium is the driver of, working with the cities in order to get their business model kind of up and running. And then my next question would be, how do the cities then work together? There must be, if you guys are running a little bit faster than the other ones, there must be some integration and coordination on the city side as well to get the learnings and use them to accelerate.
Goes back to kind of my wish, right? Is I think that, and for us in Florida, I think of it as a statewide thing, but even maybe from all of Central Florida, it would be great to have that plan just. And the airports are planned through the state aviation administration, and so having some sort of planning and collaboration, I think, is going to be important. We do. I mean, we have regular calls, for example, with the city of Tampa and with other cities in Florida about where they're thinking, what they're thinking, and even actually doing some economic demand modeling, right? Because part of the value and what allowed us, for example, to provide an incentive for this vertiport was we focused purely on the job creation component of it. But long term, right, putting a vertiport in, say, downtown Orlando and one in downtown Tampa, there's economic impact and value of that would allow us to be able to use some public dollars to make something like that happen. That's got to come because the city of Orlando and the city of Tampa are partnering together and want that connectivity, and which we do, and are able to do that. And I think that we'll see that across the board, again, not just in Florida, but probably across the globe. Of if we're going to be connecting cities, there's a tremendous value, right, to the cities to do that, and that's got to be coordinated across. And right now, there really isn't a way that cities have established that we coordinate, connecting city to city from a transportation perspective, other than the state Department of Transportation's.
Right. Okay, fantastic. I'm going to take another question from the audience right now from Tulki Jenkins. So thank you for sending it in. How will vertiports, and I'm going to send it to you, Jörn. I think that you might be best positioned as an operator. How will vertiports integrate with ad hoc inner-city aviation operations that are time critical? How will you overcome the hurdles to allow air ambulances, for example, to continue operations without risk? So maybe a bit of a airspace question, but I think it works nicely for you as well.
Yes, thank you for that question. I guess this is something that everybody thinks about. What about existing traffic that's already there, and what about also public flights that is HAM's operation, police, and so on? Of course, I would say this has to be considered beforehand, so we will not be surprised by such flights, and there have to be clear procedures in place in order to accommodate such situations. So definitely, I mean, the sky will not be crowded at the very beginning, so we will start step by step, and we also learn, and also the operators of such operations will learn and see what is the implication. So I think in the beginning, I don't see a big impact. The more we move towards high scale operations, it is clearly an issue, and we have to define what are the priority routes. So now coming back also to the case in Europe, where we have that use space regulation just about to become effective. I mean, there are some rules for manned aviation, and what about the new VTOL aircrafts and operations like we have in mind with passengers, or be it also with cargo. So definitely this has to be clarified. I see absolutely the chance to integrate that, so there's no real fight for it. I guess whenever it comes to public missions, they have a priority. At the same time, I think specifically when it comes to electric aviation, we have to consider that we need to be clear where we can go and where we can pause for a moment. So there are limitations clearly on that, so that had be already incorporated in the flight planning. All right, great. With regards to, I just got a side question in, which would be for you as well, Jörn, about how does Volocopter approach the placement? You guys have a different, slightly different business model going forward, which is inner city flights. And how are you approaching this placement of your ground infrastructure, your Voloports? Right. Yeah, as that was mentioned before, I think it's quite a challenge to find a good spot to fulfill several criteria. So now, once I assume we have a target city, so we don't talk about what is the right target city for us, but once we have identified that, then of course it has to do with some business aspects, and again putting the customer in the center. It means, what are the locations that are most attractive for a customer, so that the service is actually taken, because building up, and we see also samples of heliports around the world that were built but never operated. So this is something, of course, we have to keep in mind. Where is it attractive from the customer perspective? where's there access also with other modes of transport, as we see different users. I mean, one is the more leisure traveler, a touristic case, where the customer is less time, less concerned with time that he has to save or she. So that's why, I mean, in this cases, we can find places that are more maybe at the suburbs or attractive areas for a flight, for a touristic case. But then when it really comes to business travelers or people that are concerned with time savings, we really have to make sure that we can smoothly integrate into the existing traffic models and modes of transport. And then, of course, the airspace comes into the game. So where there is obstacle clearance, where we can actually fly in and out. And for that purpose, we're actively working on development of new procedures. So looking at existing helicopter procedures and heliport obstacle limitations that would definitely not work in many cases. So this is something, of course, we also have something already developed and are in discussions how we can fly in and out. And then I think these are the major challenges. Wherever we can find a suitable set to fulfill these criteria, that's the perfect spot for us.
Great, thank you. Damian, I have a question here from Julia Dorsal, and that is, are you cooperating with IATA or any other organization to have something similar to a standard ground handling agreement in place for UAM? Or do you know of any maybe partners who are doing that kind of work?
Thank you for the question. So we're not cooperating with the IATA at the moment. I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done within the urban air mobility industry itself, so that we figure out how do we actually, what's the ConOps for not just the vertiports, but the wider operation. And so there's a number of standardization and unification of procedures happening on the Eurokai level and sort of standard setting bodies level, and then I guess bilaterally between the we named ourselves to it with a number of the parties that we'll interface with, whether it's the vehicle operators themselves, potential FBOs that we may work with at our vertiports, and those that we don't do it ourselves. But I anticipate that similar sort of agreements will come into place within the next 1 or 2 years as we get closer to operations. Okay,
great. We have a question from Michel from Unified International, and that is, where will the first UAM vertiports be installed? I would like to offer you this one as well to you, Damien. You guys have a few projects already, I know, baking.
Yeah, I think it's a good sort of follow on from what was discussed previously. So where do we want to build these vertiports for them to make sense, to fit within the existing transport systems and really deliver the value to future customers? So we've done a number of work in, for example, Singapore, and trying to finding those locations together with the Volocopter, how we could build a meaningful network of vertiports around that city. And one of them we are hoping to develop and operationalize within the next 2 years. I'm sure there'll be more news coming out soon. We're also building one in Paris together with ADP and a number of ecosystem partners, including Volocopter, Vertical Aerospace, and a number of others, that will serve as a test bed for the industry, for it to really try out the different technologies, enabling technologies, but also sort of key technologies crucial to the actual flight operations, and will enable the participants in the project to build the trust with the authorities, particularly in France, but hopefully even beyond, and use that experience as the first stepping stone to launching commercial operations in and around Paris by 2024. So I'd say these are the two first vertiports that we'll see being built up. And then in the background, one thing I just wanted to add to the previous discussion, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of planning out the network of vertiports and developing them by, say, 2025, when we anticipate seeing the first commercial operations. But at the same time, we're thinking when or where will the vertiports be built in 2035, 2040, as some of that work and groundwork needs to be put in place today. So there's longer timelines that people may think.
Andres, with regards to what Damien was just touching on, I would like to ask you from your perspective now to bring the technology and data perspective in. With the learnings from classic revenue management and network management, what do you suggest for the UAM industry to be able to set up a sensible framework of landing sites and vertiports that will actually make money for the users and stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think if I was the one to frankly answer that, that would be a big step forward, because I think the starting point should be in general the passenger perspective. Why as a passenger I would like to choose this mode of transport over any other that's competing at the moment. And the main benefit I see is the aspect of time. So I have to be faster than with any other mode of transport. Of course, there's the environmental impact aspect or the financial aspect, but the main driver, in my opinion, is the time. And translating that into the network and the location of the vertiports, that means that the selection of these sites needs to be no, I'm not muted. It needs to be very carefully chosen. And one part is the society aspect, that you want to have it mostly outside to disturb no one, but at the same time you want to have it in the middle of the city to have the connectivity to other modes of transport. And that translated into requirements for a system or an IT landscape. That means that all the steps of the travel journey need to be aligned in a way. And also the expectation of the passenger in terms of, do I have to fit to a fixed schedule, like Lilium, for example, is going forward, or is it more really like a taxi that I call on demand and that takes me to wherever I want? And I think also here the truth is somewhere in the middle. So you need to have some kind of reliability, and also the question of punctuality in the entire travel chain plays a role. If you look at the compensation, for example, that you receive as a passenger on a traditional airline, if you're not on time or if your flight was cancelled, that would not happen in a taxi, for example. So I'm not quite sure where the UAM ecosystem will fit in here, because that very much will impact the passenger acceptance here.
Okay, great. Klaas, I have a little question for you, and this is with regards to what is the cost structure for a maintenance operation, defragmented all over the city, is there going to be a spare parts fulfillment ad hoc? Is it going to be things driving around on ground to bring parts? Is there going to be one hub per city? How do you see this? I'm sure you've had a lot of time to think about this in your role. How do you see this actually working when this is a scaled production?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I think to start with, look at the vehicle, and I think compared to conventional aviation, we will see vehicles that are much more compartmentalized, so to say, so that you can quickly, ideally, exchange components. And then given that space at the vertiports itself is likely constrained, you will make an effort to have the main MRO activities at a more centralized site, where you will also keep the majority of the stock. Yet, over time, you will see failure patterns emerging. So likely you will then aim to put a certain stock of parts that fail more often to the vertiports to quickly exchange them there if possible. These could be batteries. These could be, looking at the Volocopter, for example, where we have distributed propulsion. This could be electrical engines as well. Maybe just to fix them to then still have a ferry flight back to the MRO site to fix it there. So yes, I think considering this is a distributed operation in any case, logistics cost will be higher and you will have more forward stocking locations. Yet you will make an effort to keep the stock at the vertiports likely low, focused on the parts that fail more often, to also make the vertiports themselves efficient. And then you will have a more centralized storage at the MRO facilities, which compared to today is still distributed. And possibly adding to that, in terms of a logistics system, you may also have AOG teams, more specialized AOG teams than possibly the staff at the vertiports that technically fly out towards the vertiports with a certain stock carried along.
This is exciting stuff and a very complex system, but looking forward to seeing it in action. With regards to what you just said, how much is Lufthansa Technik already looking into? I know that there's predictive maintenance and using artificial intelligence to set this up. How fast will this come in the UAM market, in your opinion?
Well, I think if I look at the various operators, predictive maintenance will play a large role for all of them from the start and being developed while the vehicle is being developed and being also tested during the ground and the flight test, which are ongoing for many of the startups already. So considering that to a certain extent, we're looking at a new mode of transportation, of public transportation, where service uptime is of utmost importance. Hence, ideally being in front of the wave, predicting maintenance events will play a crucial role for the service uptime. And yes, this is something with Lufthansa Technik what we're looking into at the moment, still focusing on small delivery drones as their commercial operations are already ongoing with the likes of Matternet, with the likes of Zipline. But it will have the same importance likely with air taxis.
I'm going to turn over to you now, Damien, for a next question. You mentioned in your intro that you saw drone operations or cargo drone operations and air taxi operations as being quite similar, but do they also both need this central downtown location? There must also be some differences. Could you get into that, please?
Sure. So we see them as slightly separate worlds at the moment, mainly due to the fact that the passenger vehicles, eVTOLs, will be piloted in the first 3 years, which means they will be operating under very different airspace rules than drones are. And in fact, it will be much easier to operate piloted aircraft, eVTOLs for passengers than flying autonomous or even remotely piloted drones in urban environments. They both need similar infrastructure to land, of course, with cargo drones, depending on the size, but it's generally, the requirements are generally much lower. So they can land in more constrained spaces. They don't need such bulky infrastructure as we need for passenger aviation. But we can totally see a world where a vertiport, for example, in a city center, will have demand for both passenger transport but also cargo, and that may be at different times of the day. But we want to make sure that as a responsibility on us of someone who's building fixed infrastructure in a city, we make sure that the infrastructure can be multi-purpose, so it can be used for both passenger and drones. And we see these two worlds, two different concepts converging over the next decade or so as use space is implemented and we're able to operate different types of aircraft in the same airspace.
Okay, great. We have a question coming in now from Philip Stryek. I think I mispronounced your name, pardon me. Question regarding aeronautical awareness. I'm going to send it over to Jörn. What kind of procedures will you use and follow? Something like heliproc? And what solutions will be used in cockpits? Something like Garmin, Lido, Jeppesen. for flight planning. This is not a ground operations per se question, but more of a flight planning, airspace management. But Jörn, over to you.
Yeah, well, I guess it depends a bit on the different concepts. As Damian said already, we also plan to start with a pilot on board and flying according to visual flight rules. So in this respect, we have to see, of course, what is the airspace class that we fly in. Some city centers may not be in controlled airspace, so then we have clearly uncontrolled airspace, we fly VFR, so such rules would apply. In other cases, where, for example, we have the flights from and to an airport, which is clearly controlled airspace, then we operate in according to the rules that apply in such airspace classes. So we have to be flexible, and this is exactly one of the challenges that we have to accommodate our flights and equipage and procedures according to the airspace we fly in. It could be then, and on top of that, UTM or use-space airspace, whatever it's called in different parts of the world. And we see some concepts relying heavily on such ideas and services. We have to see when is the time that we can really rely on them. What is the level of performance? Are they adequate for passenger transport already? So I'm a bit, as I think as Volocopter, are more pragmatic and would say we take what we have at the moment. If there are helicopter routes and procedures that fit our purpose, we are happy to adopt them because everybody would feel comfortable with them. The authorities and all the others, they know what is happening there. But at the same time, of course, we think about other solutions, as helicopter routes are also determined by some noise signatures that we definitely will not have. So this is something that allows us to fly differently in other places, and then also to see what other airspace users are there, and is the need for strategic deconfliction there and strategic planning. Can it be on a rather remain very clear basis? So for the flight plans, I think very often it is the idea, and it will come up definitely with scaled operations. There's the need to plan in more detail. In the beginning, I think we can assume that we have a rather certain airspace, might even be segregated, and then within that airspace we can do the operation without a lot of coordination, apart from some coordination, what was mentioned before, HAMS, police, something like that. Okay, but the airspace topic is very deeply integrated with the ground infrastructure topic. I'd like to maybe check with you, Damien. So if we have an airspace planning, or the question was referring to different types of flight planning software. Lido, for instance, is from our company, Lufthansa Systems. The software necessarily has to have all of the waypoints along the way, has to have emergency landing areas, but the idea here is to become autonomous. So what kind of ground infrastructure have you already been looking at? I know that there's a lot of different types of technology available to ensure that when the eVTOL lands or takes off, that there is also in preparation for autonomy, that they're going to actually hit the top of the building and not be 5 meters off or something like that. How are you going to pull these vehicles in?
Very good question. Short answer, and I'll come back to some of the details, is we'll be on a journey. I think that we'll see a number of step changes as the industry develops and different technologies are certified and proven. As Jörn said, I think most of the vehicles will be VFR certified and operated initially, which as a vertiport operator will cater for, of course. And then the intention should be and must be to go to IFRs as quickly as possible. And what type of IFR it is, I think, is the question. Is it a traditional IFR that we see with commercial aviation, or is it more automated type of IFR flying where there's not much, there are other enabling technologies that are allowing the aircraft to fly in sort of adverse conditions, and that's something that we are working on trying to figure out what we need on the ground infrastructure to enable that, whether it's sort of precision landing or systems, whether it's ILS or others. That's something that we're still on a journey to determine that. However, I think the interesting point that Jörn raised was around helicopter routes and how do we plan the routes themselves based on existing infrastructure, based on new infrastructure. I think helicopter routes and something that we're dealing with in London, where there are established helicopter routes, but they were established in the 1970s for single-engine helicopters. So they are built, or they are designed over areas where emergency landings can be performed, so over rivers, over parks. And that's very restrictive for urban air mobility, especially on the longer term. And so we're trying to come up with concepts that would allow us to both develop the infrastructure in places which traditional helicopters, whether it's single engine or twin engine, wouldn't be able to land because of the pollution, the noise footprint that they have. But also in terms of airspace, so looking at how can we fly, I think Jörn mentioned it as well, how can we fly lower than helicopters fly today, and sort of make more use of the airspace that we have, as some of the existing rules might be quite limiting.
Okay, thanks. Matt, since you have innovation in your title, I'm going to give this question to you because I think it maybe covers a little bit of a wider breadth of what you're doing in your daily business. The question comes from Kai Plottner from Beilharz Luftfahrt, and it says, I totally agree with needed UAM standards like we have in aviation to ensure worldwide operations, but how are you ensuring that today's set standards will be compatible with future UAM technological developments, example, powertrains, communication, or autonomy? A bit of a regulatory and standards.
Yeah, I mean, we from a city's perspective, right, we're not engaged in that side of the regulatory piece, but I will say from the infrastructure side and from I think there's an acknowledgement, that what we're building today, and it's not my money, so I feel bad saying this, but what we're building today is probably going to be outdated. And I think anyone who thinks that the first vertiports that are built are going to be the vertiports that are being, and they may still be used in 25 years, but that is the way that we will be building vertiports in 25 years is fooling themselves. And so I think just like from the city's perspective, I was talking about, we're going into this knowing that we're going to learn as we go. I know, and at least with our partners that we've been working with, there's an assumption that we are learning as we go. And so I think those standards will evolve, whether that's probably in the aircraft, on the ground, and I think you've got to be able to plan for that. And I think the more time and money we spend sometimes on trying to decide what we think it's going to be is sometimes wasted time and money. And so I think that there's an element of, you want to, I'm from Florida, we have lots of hurricanes. We think of this like hurricane path, right? We want to kind of know where we're going and have directionally understanding of where that is and make sure everything fits within that. But the closer we get to, launching, the closer we get to, at scale, the more we'll understand those things. So I think that part of it is planning for the fact that there is those unknowns and there will be changes.
But even if your first vertiport turns into a throwaway solution in 25 years, it will still be a great tourist attraction for Orlando. So when we're swinging by Disney, we can go and check out the first infrastructure there.
Yeah, I mean, not to poke at our partners at Disney, but there was originally an airport at Disney, and Walt Disney was very insistent upon there being an airport on Disney property. And today, if you go to Magic Kingdom and you bring an RV, what you were actually parking on is the old airport, right? And so he had this idea and this plan, and they invested the money and did it, and it didn't work. And for a variety of reasons, and they obviously needed the support of a larger airport. But I think it is that, right? We plan for this idea that if it doesn't work, what is the reuse? What is the how are you building things in a way that does allow for adaptability in the future? I know that Skyports has been big on that, and I appreciate their thought leadership in thinking about how do you make sure that the investment you're making is smart and that you're not
tear down this 50, 20, whatever it is, $1 million building to replace it, right? How do you make sure that it's adaptable? I think that's important.
Yeah. All right, great. So What is the profile of an early adapter on a client, operator, vertiport owner, and city level? From Michel van Ierland, Unified International. I am going to give this question to the group. What is the profile of an early adapter on a client, operator, vertiport owner, and city level? You're all represented here, so who would like to start?
I'm not sure I understand the question correctly, but what is the profile?
An early adapter. So what does an early adapter client look like? A client maybe is Uber a client potentially? I know that Schenker is an investor at Voloport because they also would like to deliver packages or cargo with you. This is a client, for instance. So what kind of profile do these clients have? Maybe what kind of profile does a passenger have? An early passenger, an operator?
What I would look at, if I can just contribute one opinion to that question, is as a decision criteria, so to say, I would look at the substitution cost of this client, because he will go for urban air mobility, or he will go for an air taxi if it is really the customer using it or the operator offering it, if the substitution costs are very high. So, for example, there is no other infrastructure, or it is very valuable, as Matt pointed out earlier. It stimulates economic growth to establishing an additional connection between Atlanta and Tampa, if I understood that correctly, or between Atlanta and Palm Beach. And if this mode of transportation achieves that in a faster way, hence has less cost, or the substitution cost of going by airplane is higher, then this will be a key driver, in my opinion, for early adoption. So really looking at the alternatives that are available today, and then seeing how air taxis can be beneficial in terms of offering a quote unquote better service.
Yeah. So Matt, you've done some. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. You were about to say something anyway.
No, I was just saying, I would add to that, and again, this is obviously a pitch for Orlando and other cities that are high in tourism. Is I think that it's not public acceptance, right? Just from will the community allow for vertiport, but it's public acceptance of will people fly, right? And so I think to the extent that people who travel, right, especially on a leisure travel, and even on business travel, are more likely to be able to take what I'll call even if it's a time risk and cost risk. To try something new. And so we see that all the time in Orlando with all sorts, whether it's transportation or where they're staying in their hotel, that you're willing to do something because it's new and different, and you can do it once and you'll learn and you'll move on. And I think that provides a unique opportunity. And so it's not that these are pilot projects, right? I want to distinguish these are would be a commercial operation, but knowing that your passenger has a little bit more leeway, right, than say a daily commuter or somebody who's trying to make it in time for a business meeting. And so I think, having some of that flexibility built in early on, I think is going to be important. And we see that, if you look at, places where any new technology or products and services are tried, right, those are probably good test markets in general for this type of service as well.
So, but what kind of research have all of you already done on passenger acceptance, passenger willingness to pay? Which are the right areas to set up shop? Which are the right passenger demographics to go after? You just mentioned travelers. This is an obvious as a mode of transport, so travelers is an obvious one. What else has to be in place for somebody to choose to get an unmanned vehicle?
If I can just maybe add our view here. Of course, we did some surveys already and are very keen to learn about our customers. In the end, it was said before, I think it's key. Otherwise, we develop something that is not accepted. So we have several studies. And it turned out that it is really important to show the potential customers the product. And as we had that flight very specifically in Stuttgart some time ago, we asked more than hundreds of people before the flight, what are their expectations, acceptance, how they would use it or not. And then after executing the flight, we said, please come back and tell us again what you think about it. And it was surprisingly to see, not for us, but of course it was obvious then that the mood or the opinion changed, that they actually were more positive and said we had more concerns about the noise. We also asked about willingness to enter an aircraft with a pilot or without, the same we did in Singapore when we had that Voloport there, and see what is the acceptance. So we felt, okay, it's a 50-50 situation, sometimes also depending on the region, on age, and on the various aspects. People are more prepared to use the service, whereas others are a bit more hesitant. So I think we have quite a good feeling, and also that's why we target our cities and customer groups according what we learned about them. But yes, I think it's very important to actually demonstrate, and this is what we did, and why we think it's very important actually to show and bring them the service and what we have in mind and planned very close to the potential customer, because simply there's nothing much around, and there are some wrong expectations sometimes, or even some misperceptions, and it's really helpful to build up the trust and then get the acceptance by the public.
I have a couple of questions came in from Daryl Swanson, and they are, so given the inability for eVTOL to hover hold for extended periods, to believe that we will have to go to a slot managed system sooner rather than later. I know this is a quite big expertise of Andres. Maybe you could start off.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm pretty sure it will, but as Matt says, that the time will show, because the early adopters, so this will be the techies, and there will be no, let's say, capacity constraints, and also I see a second phase where maybe less price sensitive people will use the service just for the benefit of going faster. But as soon as it becomes more and more familiar, and that very much depends on the pricing schemes that will be offered. And I know the advertising claim that it will be for the price of a normal taxi ride. And if that's the case one day, I can imagine that the resource that will be most wanted is the infrastructure on the ground, because that's what we already see today. The slot handling is the bottleneck for aviation at the airports, classic aviation today. And you have also even this 80-20 rule, grandfather rights, that even if you don't use your slots, you lose them immediately. And that very much is driven also by the competition. And if I see that we have this system of vertiports with multiple or different operators competing for the same infrastructure, at that point in time, of course, the slot handling will become an issue. If that at the end of the day substantiates in holding patterns or hovering, kinds of that, I think that is a different aspect, because that's a safety related aspect, and of course no commercial aspect ever stands over safety.
So if we have the bottleneck of landing spots, and we have a question as well for a city like London or Munich, or one of the main cities in the world, how many vertiports are actually going to be available when everything is scaled up? We've had a lot of discussions in the past on the other events that aircraft are going to be pushed out. You might be using different kinds of assembly lines for automotive that are already in existence, and maybe the assembly and production and manufacturing of the vehicles will go quickly in 10 or 15 or 20 years. But what about the vertiport itself? I know that the Voloport is a modular system. How many can we expect to have in a city? What do you guys think about that?
It's a good question. I think it'll very much depend on the city and a network, and how we think about networks. For us, of course, it's not just the city. We're looking at more regional approach. So connecting cities between each other. I think there's a research that came out today from one of the European projects under, I believe, CSAR or H2020, which claimed that we'll need thousands of vertiports in Europe. I think the sort of average number for Frankfurt was around 350. I think it's a nice future that we should all be aspiring to, but it's not the near future. I think initially the industry will grow in a very use case by use case approach, and the network will sort of grow by demand, but also initially the industry will be supply constrained through the vehicles. So I think we'll see a shift in the constraint where as the production of vehicles ramps up, then the infrastructure constraint where we don't have enough landing sites will become apparent. And in one way of solving it is of course having different sizes of vertiports. So we are planning larger vertiport sites which can take large number of slots of vehicles, but equally so smaller sites which are catered to sort of smaller numbers of passengers, but can fit into more locations around the city which are more constrained. So I think that'll be a sort of combination. But if I was to put a number, I think within the next 10 to 15 years, we're looking to build between 15 and 20 vertiports in the bigger cities.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
If I can add something to that, I think what is important from an industry perspective, or what the industry should drive at, assuming that there are certain attractive locations in each city for a given use case, and there are multiple competitors in terms of air taxis for this use case, is developing and building vertiports that can be used by multiple different vehicle types. So thereby, to a certain extent, limiting the amount of infrastructure required. I think that is something that is important that we might not see in the very beginning if various air taxi service providers start in different cities across the world where they have dedicated infrastructure, but at some point in time, or at least thinking out the infrastructure in a way that it can be used by different types.
I agree, Klasen. When we were talking to Matt on the prep call for here, he also indicated that he has a very great interest to having this infrastructure be owned partially or all by cities, and this is the American model as well for airports, but maybe get into that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, and that was going to be my question is, I mean, whether it's a city or government entity, I think there's a valid argument for why regionally, if government could get the funding together to manage in the same way in the US we manage our airport networks. But I think that, you know, that to me is the issue, is if we can, you know, have consolidated efforts, whether that's in the private sector or in the public sector, to build out the infrastructure versus individualized efforts. And I think if it's going to continue to be individualized efforts, I think we're going to run into challenges scaling up for a variety of reasons. I mean, government officials within cities and within counties are not going to want to have to start hiring 3 people just to handle the inbound issues that they're having. And so I'm curious as to everyone else's thoughts of how you see that playing out, right? We know what's happening today, which is fairly individualized for the most part, but how do we see that kind of shifting over the next, 5, 10, 15 years?
Skyports' perspective is that the infrastructure needs to be open access over time. We may start with, as we're building the industry from scratch, and first initial operations may require that there is some level of I would say individuality in having infrastructure that is tailored to your specific operations. But I think over time that infrastructure needs to become open access to ensure that equity in terms of access to the airspace is there. That when you create a parallel, it's the same thing as saying that, for example, Uber would have its own curbs to stop at. I just don't see infrastructure which is not open access being very efficient and enabling the ultimately the cost to the passenger being as low as possible. So that's why we see sort of our role, making sure that whatever infrastructure we put in place can be used by any of the operators and any of the vehicles that are operating in the market, but also that there's equity of access, which if we have a slot management system, of course, will become difficult, but which you don't see a world where each different vehicle has its own specific infrastructure.
Yeah, maybe to add on that, I would agree, specifically when there's space available. I think the interesting question here is if we also talk about the number of vertiports and is it rather small or bigger ones. the smaller the vertiport gets, I mean, that there's a real challenge to accommodate different types of aircraft. And as long as it's the same type of aircraft, we have certain aerodromes around the world. I think you're well aware of them, that for certain locations, only specific aircraft can fly into these aerodromes due to some limitations for approach procedures, for example. And also we talk about just emerging market with different systems for propulsion. I mean, most probably electric driven aircraft will be maybe more the rule than the exemption, but there are still other concepts around with hydrogen and things like that. So to have all that infrastructure at the vertiport is quite a challenge, specifically when there are smaller ones. So I would like to see how this turns out later on. I mean, if we talk about vertiports on the green field, and that might be more applicable to the US or suburban areas where you have actually the chance to accommodate more. The smaller it gets, I think the real challenge starts when you try to accommodate a variety of aircraft and maybe not so much air operators. I would totally agree. The better is used. I mean, it is principle if the cost can be shared, but also the capacity is really limited. And if the demand is much higher, we have to apply principles that are fair, but and allow also from the commercial perspective an air operator to operate there. If there's only 1 or 2 flights an hour or whatever, the service becomes unattractive and we cannot reliably offer a service. I think the same with what we see in airports or with airlines as well. It's about frequency. Certain routes have to be flown on a very frequent basis to become attractive, and other competitors are pushed out immediately if they cannot match that. So this is quite of a challenge. Also, the smaller and more into the city we go.
You just talked about all of the infrastructure that needs to go on to one of these vertiports in order to operate it. I have a question here from Luke Ribich, talking about the prevailing master planning document for vehicles to conform to an MSG3 plus or similar strategy, and what kind of actual servicing inspection needs would be mandatory, like from what you've been hearing, talking to different regulators, what kind of servicing and maintenance procedures or ready for takeoff procedures are you expecting to have to do every single time? Jörn, I think maybe that would be a good one for you.
Right, maybe I try to answer that. I mean, there's still a lot of in progress, so I think we don't have the answers yet for all these questions. As far as Volocopter and our aircraft is concerned, I mean, we absolutely reduce complexity of the aircraft. This is one of the main principles to really, and it was mentioned before, keep also operating costs very low when it comes to maintenance and everything that is needed in order to maintain, have the continuous airworthiness and all what is needed, also with pre-flight checks and things like that. So I definitely see something much lower than with comparable with helicopters or other ones, but I cannot quote any standards yet or regulations that are in place for this at the moment.
What is the turnaround time for a Volo City, including battery change? Question from Gary Varmark.
Right, the turnaround time we're aiming for is less than 10 minutes.
Less than 10 minutes. And right now you're currently planning to change out all 9 batteries?
That is correct, yes. Our concept foresees to swap the batteries. So we have new and charged batteries before every flight that are charged external of the aircraft, and then we take out the used ones. And that is the principle, yes. What kind of energy, I don't know, access to the grid needs to be available? I imagine if you put these high voltage charging stations on the tops of buildings or on the tops of maybe crumbling infrastructure or existing high rises, that might not work very well. What can we expect to? Yeah, exactly. We are well aware of that problem, and I think specifically when you look at infrastructure that will be erected on top of existing buildings, we definitely face that problem and challenge. And that is actually one of the problem or one of the issues that brought us to that solution. because if you don't quick charge, you don't have that high requirements for power, and also it relates to some extent to firefighting, rescue procedures, and all the criticality we have related to that. You can see that from, I mean, luckily there are some experience with automotive industry and also charging systems, but this is not readily usable for aviation purposes. I think we have some standardization organizations and also regulators looking very closely into that. So there's still some way to go, but exactly this is a big challenge. And the way we chose to charge the battery is really that we can charge the batteries very slowly at the optimum conditions with 1C. So we take the time, charge the battery, because this is one of the most costly item of the aircraft, and will not just for the sake of quick turnarounds stress the battery and throw them away after a couple of flights. And it also alleviates the stress for the need to have power wherever we have the vertiport. It is really comparable low to quick charge.
So you're planning a battery system where you're taking batteries away to charge them and then bring them back, like a logistics system behind that?
Exactly, yes.
Interesting, okay. A good question coming in, which I'm also curious about, from Lawrence Collin, or maybe Colin Lawrence, not sure. What security protocols will accompany this mode of transport? For instance, that passengers are scanned. I think Damian would be a good one for you.
It's a good question. I think there is no regulation around it. Same with helicopters. When you get on a helicopter here in London, in fact, I think in most cities, countries around the world, you don't have to go through any screening by law. We have an internal policy that we want to adopt similar levels of safety as we see at commercial airports. So screening every passenger, identifying every passenger. However, we can do it in ways which are not as intrusive, and I would say don't deteriorate the passenger experience. As we know at airports where you have to queue, there's unpredictability of how long it can take. And given that there is no existing regulation, and we're drafting the regulation, but also we don't have to deal with any legacy systems, there are ways that we can make it, I would say, much more innovative than what we see in sort of current aviation. We can use technologies which are more experimental than those that could be adopted in large-scale airports. My personal opinion is that over time it will be required that every passenger is identified and scanned, security checked in some way or form. As unfortunately that's the world we live in.
No, that's fine, but I think that there's a lot of test cases in classic airports as well, going towards touchless scanning and identification. There's a lot of things happening in the classic market as well. Perfect. Would it be feasible, from Gaurav Dolia, good question, would it be feasible to put a vertiport on top of the terminal buildings to have an easy airside transfer for passengers? Moreover, can we see floating vertiports becoming a reality in the future? Damien, you too, because of your relationship with Europa.
Sure, we spend a lot of time trying to understand where is the most ideal location at an airport, whether it's on the airside, so that when you land, you're already cleaned. You can go straight on the aircraft, or the other way around. Of course, putting it on a terminal makes it also usable for passengers which are not necessarily customers of the airport. So it can be people coming from the street, living by the airport, getting on a vertiport and flying somewhere else. So I think it very much depends on the use case and also the availability of the space. Often large airports are extremely constrained both on airside and landside. I would say the most frequent solution that we have is using some of the car parks, multi-story car parks, which are operated by airports. They're generally parallel with the runways as well, so we don't sort of interfere with the existing operation of the airport and can sort of live in harmony. But I can see a world, especially for airports which are being redeveloped, that the terminal can be put on top of, sorry, the vertiport can be put on top of the terminal. And in terms of floating vertiports, I think it's a very good environment, rivers or lakes, where to locate vertiports, especially in cities or countries where there's a lot of water. So vertiport is one. I think Florida will definitely be one. And there are precedents to it. Not necessarily floating, but London Heliport is partially on the river, which makes it a lot easier from a number of ways. So it's definitely a solution that we will see being quite frequented in the future.
Matt, what other locations from a city perspective are very interesting?
Yeah, I mean, I think airport is where we started, and obviously where, you know, from an initial vertiport perspective, the Lake Nona one is, as I said, you know, part of what we think of as the aerotropolis of Orlando. And, you know, we did look, there's actually a helistop on top of our terminal, but take a look at how the Orlando International Airport is configured, and you'll see it would be logistically impossible for us to get any sort of vehicle in and out of there based on where the runways are. I think to that point, though, I think what will happen is, and if you kind of think about where we've put the one in Orlando, it's, you know, like I said, as close as we can get today. I think they'll continue to get closer. And I think, again, once they're operating in airports, are able to see and understand the FAA and all the, you know, the authorities are able to better understand how that works, I think we'll see them get closer and closer. And so, again, I think that will evolve, and we anticipate that evolving. Our airport anticipates that evolving. It's just level of comfort. Other locations that are ideal, I mean, to me, is rooftop of parking garages. And as Damian pointed out, you know, we have a tremendous amount of lakes, you know, but more importantly, probably what we consider like our stormwater retention ponds. Again, ensuring that they have enough water in them at all times. But, you know, lakes, while they're plentiful in a community like Florida, you know, they're also great, you know, real estate to be on a lake, and people may or may not want to have these things landing on a lake in which the real estate is on. But we have enough of other opportunities where it would work. But I think rooftop of city-owned parking garages or just parking garages in general are prime. You know, there's a concern long-term of where the revenue from parking is going to come from as Uber and Lyft and other mobility solutions come to hold. And so this is a great kind of cost recovery moment for you know, parking services in cities, if again they can understand that shift may have to happen now, when you're still making money off of your garage, but it's, you know, saving yourself from later. And that's going to be a big challenge. It's a challenge I've talked about in other cities, is that rooftop makes money. And so that is a cost that the city will incur, that where we have debt payments that are, you know, tied to that, that have to come from somewhere. And so, you know, I think long term that'll be hopefully easy to make up when you have commercial operations going. But there's going to be that in between where, you know, cities that can figure that out are going to be able to take advantage of some of that great infrastructure and potentially profit down the road from that.
I know that there's a lot of people on this call, and I know that some of them are in real estate. What financial mechanisms, commercial mechanisms are they currently using to calculate whether this is a good idea for them?
Skyports.
Skyports, that's for you, Skyports? Okay.
Well, the issue is there's a huge information gap between other industries, particularly real estate and property, and aviation and urban air mobility in particular. So we're trying to bridge that gap as we speak both languages. We understand what investors and owners are looking for in terms of return on their investment, what risks they are sensitive to. And so we're in quite a unique position where we can appeal to both. So we know what the users of the vertiport, i.e. operators of the aircraft, are looking for: landing fees, experience, convenience, reliability. But at the same time, we know what the real estate owner wants. They obviously want the connection resulting from having a vertiport, but it's more about how placemaking, how does it fit within the environment around it, the negative impacts it may have, but also the return. So we have a number of models in which we work with property owners. Sometimes we simply lease the land and become a tenant and sort of pay rent to the owner. Sometimes we do joint ventures where the owner actually wants to share the upside risk of this industry. and sort of we help them understand what is the likely return on investment over time, as it's not a sort of quick buck industry, but we'll see a journey where the frequency of operation and type of operation changes significantly over time.
And how far out do you see the return on the investment?
How far out?
Yeah.
Well, the good thing is it will, based on our modeling, will reach fairly positive cash flow very soon. So depending on the ramp up. The return on investment really depends on the cost of building a vertiport. If it's on a huge, nice building which needs a lot of structural reinforcement, then and energizing, which can go into millions, then obviously the return on investment will be longer. So it depends where we put it, but also depending on our understanding, it should be a very profitable venture. So which is important, as it makes it an attractive proposition to the property owners as well. So an important factor for the industry.
Mm.
I have one other.
Yeah.
So one other piece, and Damien can disagree, but I think I would add to his list is if the developer or property owner has multiple properties, right? And so as we think about, either from the city's perspective, Skyports or an operator, like doing deals with multiple people is costly, right? There's a lot of time, especially right now, invested in that. And so somebody who can activate multiple pieces of property either within a city or within a region or whatever that might look like is incredibly useful and helpful, right? Because otherwise we have to have 5 real estate partners to activate 5 vertiports, whereas if you have 1 real estate partner, you can activate 5 vertiports that are in ideal locations. Even if you only end up using 3 of them and activating 3, having that as a possibility, I think is advantageous for that developer.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree. I mean, for us, every time that we deal with a larger portfolio owner, we try and screen all of their properties. So I totally see that it's economies of scale of using portfolios. Again, the bridge that these kind of companies like I was talking to bridge is the information gap, and you don't. Aviation infrastructure is a field in itself. So what we see is property owners that there are in commercial real estate, they don't necessarily have the skill set and knowledge of being able to design and build and operate aviation grade infrastructure.
Klaas, I want to turn the question over to you. I know that you've had a couple of drone delivery projects in Fraport and in Hamburg. What were the infrastructure issues, challenges there in these projects?
Well, admittingly, predominantly those projects we carried out here in Hamburg, those were carried out between clinics and hospitals. So admittingly, we used their helipads because that was the easy way to do it, and that was integrated in a traditional way into the current ATC infrastructure. So we were there in contact with the Hamburg Tower. However, I think it was nevertheless the way forward to slowly but steadily, I mean, as was reflected by my fellow speakers earlier, this will be a step-by-step approach before it scales, and hence using what is already available to prove the system and prove that it's safe, and then eventually adding up and integrating with novel technologies to enable a scaling.
Okay. I have a bit of a different question. I'm going to turn over to you, Matt, and just to set the stage for, I don't know, going back a couple of years, what was the journey like and the negotiation like with Lilium to get this deal closed and to get an agreement from all of the stakeholders? If you can tell us a little bit about that experience.
Sure, I can kind of give the high level. So we started the project probably 4.5 years ago. really as a result of what happened after Uber and Lyft. And our mayor said, look, cities in general, I don't want to say we're caught off guard, but we're certainly not prepared from a policy perspective to handle what happened with Uber and Lyft coming into cities. And he kind of said, what's the next thing that we're not preparing for? And so we came back and said, we think it's this. And he said, great, we're gonna tackle it. And so we started doing that. We actually have had conversations with other OEMs that were, at that point in time, very much in, exploratory. We assumed we were going to be moving towards doing some sort of a helicopter pilot service. That was our direction we were going in. And we ended up getting connected with Lilium, and about the exact same time, unbeknownst to us, Tavistock, which is who's developing that vertiport out in Lake Nona, is the single developer out in that community. They were engaging in their own project to look at advanced air mobility, and so it was really a coming together of a local developer that we had already had a great relationship with, and the city of Orlando, and then finding the right partner. And so we had, like I said, different conversations. And for us, just from a use case standpoint, we think that the regional connectivity piece is really strong for Orlando and a great way for us to start. And so we had conversations for actually a couple of years with Lilium, really thinking about what this is going to look like. And our message and continues to be, we weren't interested in an announcement from an operator that didn't have some sort of site selection and analysis and understanding that we were actually going to build a vertiport, right? We wanted to know that the infrastructure was going to be activated, because that, from a city's perspective, is the biggest challenge. And so having that, from a capital perspective and land development perspective lined up, that we could see a path to actually making it happen, was really important for us. And so that was a lot of the work that we were doing, was making sure that it was feasible, from a regulatory standpoint, all the way up the chain. And so that was, what the tremendous amount of work was. And then, again, helping, and this goes for every organization we talk to, whether it's an OEM or any other partner, is, helping them to understand what our needs are as a city and how they can help meet those needs, right? This needs, part of the partnership is making sure that this isn't just, somebody coming in. If we wanted that, we would have waited 10 years and let somebody come in forced away and tell us where they're putting it, and it shows up as an application in the city planning department, right? We wanted a partnership. And so that's what a lot of those conversations were, was us learning from what they had and other partners have, and moving that forward.
Fantastic. And Jörn, very quickly, is that the same as the experience with Volocopter in Singapore? Is it a little bit different?
Yeah, it's similar, I think. It really takes time, but it's good to see if authorities are very open and we can work closely together, and also the authorities that have to be involved have a very close contact. So if you have a number of stakeholders, if they can work and collaborate very smoothly, I think that helps a lot. Yeah, but definitely it takes months, sometimes years to prepare something, definitely. Okay.
I'd like to reinforce that point. I think what Matt is doing in Orlando with his colleagues, what's happening in Singapore with the authorities there, and there's a number of similar examples, like I think Miami is getting involved, Los Angeles, Ingolstadt in Germany. These initiatives are extremely helpful for this industry to build something that paints the picture or fulfills the requirements of both the cities, but also the industry and future users. And I just hope that as we progress, there will be more and more of these proactive partnerships between cities and regions with the industry, so that we can really make the most of the opportunity that we have.
Okay, thanks. We are getting closer to the end. I'd like to ask you guys in a quick round now for some last thoughts and last really drivers to make the ground operations aspect accelerated, streamlined, and easier for all of the stakeholders. Jörn, I'm going to start with you because you're top left.
Yeah, thank you. I think to some extent I have to repeat myself from what I said in the beginning. I think we definitely need some regulation standards. Also, authorities are waiting for that in order to approve infrastructure. It takes time. It's not only months, it's years before we have new infrastructure. Maybe we can refurbish existing ones. So again, more than happy also to see how we specifically with the EASA cooperate in that, and also what was mentioned before, any other CAA, just to encourage that exchange. We are open and have our infrastructure requirements ready in our shelf, open to hand it over to anybody who would be interested to build some Voloport or Vertiport in general. And yes, it's always good to have strong partners and to share the risk and the chances.
Okay, thanks. Andres.
Yeah, thanks for the discussion first, of course, and the good question that came in. I'm convinced, and I'm happy and proud to be part of this development, because what I see, this starting small, experimenting, to have the courage to really go a way that no one gone before, yeah, gives me a good feeling. And at the same time, I see the parallels between the established world, and instead of starting from scratch in every aspect, I would really love to see what can be taken over from the traditional airline business and from already established procedures that may shorten the way to fully operational network, and also regulations or like ground handling agreements. Many of what is already there can be taken over, but at the same time, as I said in the beginning, in a modular way, to rebuild a new network of applications and infrastructure. And that's something that I'm very much looking forward to, and yeah, probably part of that. Thank you.
Thanks. Damian. You're on mute.
Sorry, that was going to happen. So the most useful experience we had as a company by far was our Singapore project with Volocopter. And when you actually build a concept and put it into practice, you start learning things that you wouldn't even think about during the planning and design stage. So I think what we're going to see as soon as some of the operations are, as they commence over the next few years, whether it's test beds or real operations, the data that we generate will be immensely useful for everyone to optimize the operations and scale of the industry. And I hope that there will be a sharing culture within the industry of sharing data around operations, around noise, the impact on the communities, and I think that we can use amazing solutions that are already applied to aviation, as Andres said, but also concepts and systems that are only being developed specifically for this industry, and we can learn that way. So I think as soon as we have operations live, the industry will shift the gears and be much better at learning from mistakes and improving.
I agree, and I think the idea is not to copy aviation, but to take aviation, rethink it, and think it in this new constellation. It's a very different constellation. Klaas.
Well, picking up on that, I wouldn't disagree. I would just emphasize the point that there needs to be an integration with current conventional aviation to benefit both and to enable both to further grow and scale. I think that is one key point that we need, and your earlier question regarding Hamburg, I think, is a good example where we had to take that in mind, also had to take the route planning over the city in mind. So I think these projects really help to pave the way for urban air mobility, air taxi operations. And the last point is, and we have met on this panel, so the communities engaging in that, because to really contribute value from a customer point of view, it is also the integration with public transportation, and the communities quite often are the owner of public transport operators. So communities really engaging here and considering this air transport system as a part of their public transportation offering, I think is really great and is what we need to really generate value from a customer perspective, and thereby also inducing demand.
Matt, last thoughts.
Yeah, to add, I think, to that, I think don't underestimate the level of effort needed to work with cities, and I say that as hopefully a very cooperative city. But it is a heavy lift, and so either A, be fully prepared for that heavy lift, or I point to Damian. That's why Skyports exists, right? Is to be able to shoulder that heavy lift. And so I think either be prepared to do it yourself or find the right partner that's going to do it. But if you're ignoring it, it's going to become a problem. And then I think the second piece is, in terms of engaging with communities, please, consider, engaging with and supporting the nonprofit CAMI, because they are doing a good job of helping to educate. I mean, at this point, that's, the big key here is educating cities and communities, really, hopefully across the globe, but certainly in North America, on what is it going to take for cities to evolve our policies so that it does enable advanced air mobility. So just don't think that it's as easy as picking a site in the city and getting the capital. There's a lot more from a ground level perspective involved in that.
Yeah, I imagine the stakeholder management is of epic proportions.
Yes.
Very good. Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you for your final remarks and for all of your remarks. I think it was a fantastic discussion. I learned a lot. I hope all of you online learned a lot as well. And as I mentioned before, the video will be available. Afterwards, we need a couple of days to edit out any kind of technical issues that we've had over the course of the MS Teams live event today. We also have a ton of questions. I still have 37 questions which have not been answered, so we are going to put them also onto LinkedIn under the event itself on LinkedIn and tag each of you to hopefully answer them over the next days. So all of you who are still tuning in, please check back there for your questions. We'll have answers for you in the next days. Please be patient. The following events we're also busy working on filling with speakerships and getting the right group of people together to dive in 360 degrees and figure out how this UAM journey is developing. The next event we have on 27th of May, sorry, it's so small for me, 2021, the supply chain event is the next one. The registration will be open, I think, after the weekend, so check that out. And then we're going to have a flight operations event in July, followed by the big one, the customer experience and acceptance, which is something which comes back in every single event that we've had as being the major factor to take into consideration. Then commercial, and then sustainability. If you have other ideas for other events, reach out to us. We're open and willing to talk about anything, but those are the planned ones. And otherwise, get in touch and look for what's coming up next. And again, the recording will be up soon. Thank you so much to all of our speakers today. I hope that you enjoyed and learned a little bit from the panel here as well. And looking very much forward to meeting you all again, hopefully in real life at some point soon. Thank you so much.